Chief Acquisition Officer there, led the VA response to the reorg memo 1722, and has served in 4 different cabinet agencies working in procurement, program management, acquisition, and change management. He is now the co-founder and partner of Potomac Ridge Consulting. Greg, would you come up, please?
Good afternoon. We've got a great panel following up Ben's a great talk about what's going on at OSD. And if I would, I'd ask the panel members to come on up. As you come up, I will start to go through the bios, and then we'll kind of get our position. A few questions that will get us started, but please have some of your questions in mind. We'll certainly take questions from the audience. If you've got a question you really want to ask, the folks with the microphone, if you write that question on the back of a $20 bill, you're more than likely to get the microphone than it's not. So that's another fundraising effort that we could do for ACT-IAC. It's great to be part of the panel today, and Tim and Tiffany, thanks for the event you all have put together. The panelists up here, I'll do a quick bio for each one, and then we'll jump right in. Alan and Chvotkin, Executive Vice President in Counsel, Professional Services Counsel. He's the Vice President and of Counsel there. There were principals really leading in principal trade association for government technology and professional services. Prior to that, joined in PSC, he was Vice President at AT&T. He's a member of the American Supreme Court and District of Columbia Bar Associations, and is a fellow of the National Contract Management Association. Holds a master's also in public administration and a bachelor's in political science, which served him well on a lot of his dealings in the wonderful congressional halls. Michael Fischetti is the Executive Director of National Contract Management Association. As such, and Mike is responsible for the professional association that has over 20,000 contracting and acquisition professionals, 111 chapters, and puts on, of course, conferences, education, and certification programs. Before becoming Executive Director, he served in many roles on NCMA, and before that was a CAE at Military Healthcare Systems. I worked TRICARE, Department of Energy, a lot of experience acquisition, lots of degrees, including his Juris Doctorate. He also has bachelor's, master's. The degrees most proud of, I know, is his Master's of Science in National Defense University at ICAF, where he was, that's where I first met Mike. He was on an academic scholarship. I was on an athletic scholarship. We had 2 different tracks there at the school. But Mike, thanks so much for coming. Dave Drabkin, and Ben mentioned the Section 809 panel. Dave's the chairman of the panel. Before that, he also was a member on the panel. He's also Administrator Counsel, Defense and Science Industries Association, Principal Drabkin and Associates. He teaches, he does some of everything that you can imagine on the Procurement Roundtable. He's a fellow at NCMA. A long list of activities, served on the SARA panel, so he's been in this business for a long time. Richard Spires is CEO of Learning Tree International, and Richard's actually doing double duty today. He was on one of the panels earlier, so you'll get twice the pay. 2 stars, exactly. Richard served as a CIO before going to Learning Tree. He served as a CIO at DHS, and also served as the Vice Chairman of the Federal CIO Council. Prior to that, he worked at the IRS and was really leading IRS's Business Systems Modernization Program, a huge and complex IT modernization program for the IRS. He also worked in private industry, CEO of Mantis, and also spent some time at SRA. Please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel. All right, I'm going to fire my first question, then come join you. And Alan, I think I'll start with you. We've heard a lot already today about procurement reform and the pace of reform, and we even heard Ben talk about there were 24 studies, so what's going to be different about this time? Whether it's FAR-based, OTA, there's lots of different aspects of this. But what do you think this time, what are the essential elements, or what do we need to get right in order to really make progress this time?
That's a difficult question, but let me focus on what I think are 4 problems that the current regime is trying to address. The first is focus on procedural perfection under the current acquisition system. Secondly, a focus on inputs rather than outputs or outcomes in the current system. Third, I think there is a an effort at little or no tolerance for risk or failure. And finally, I think there's a concern about cost versus value. You think about those four issues that permeate the acquisition thinking. From an industry standpoint, I think see acquisition reform as first focusing on speed to outcomes. Just got to narrow the time frame for getting from requirements generation to goods and services in the hands of the user. Secondly, there is a focus of reliance on commercial marketplace. That may be for commercial items, it may be for other kinds of activities, but a strong emphasis on commerciality, commercial marketplaces. Third, I think there's an appropriate trend to expand the opportunities for small businesses and for non-traditional companies, although we're going to have some conversations about that capability. And finally, I think there is an effort at no let up in the accountability element, but just changing on how you measure accountability. Those seem to me to be the four key elements of driving the acquisition reform process. But I want to reiterate, though, I think that it's very important that we get requirements right. So if you don't get those requirements right at the beginning, you're not going to get a good acquisition and you're not going to get the outcomes you need. And finally, I think we're going to have to do more to make sure we have a well-trained both acquisition as well as a technology workforce. And then last but not least, to address some of the lingering barriers to success in the acquisition, and that's outside of the process. That's in budgeting and accounting, appropriations laws that have to come next. Other than that, should be a piece of cake.
Wow, there was a lot to cover. Anybody wanted to jump on and add anything that Alan talked about in his?
Well, a theme that it's always been big with me, having been in government a couple different times and seeing how it works on the inside. And there's a lot of different types of acquisitions, right? So let's talk about the ones that usually go wrong, which are the larger programmatic types of acquisitions. And picking up on this theme about, yeah, you got to get your requirements right, but how do you actually do that, right? And I go back to my experiences, and I relayed this in this other discussion we had earlier about the fact of the matter is when you really do operate in a good team environment with all the right stakeholders working together as a real team, that's where I've seen real success. So when I've reviewed, and I've reviewed many programs in government, where I have found real problems isn't so much when you get into the actual procurement. It really predates that, right? Where you don't have the right kind of alignment, maybe even don't have the right skill sets in some cases. But I'm talking about the government now, within the government, but getting the right program people, working with the end users, working with obviously the procurement organization, other stakeholders like legal and security and the like. You got to form that team and you got to be aligned. And once you do that, that's where I have seen that things actually go fairly well. Or if you're going to have real problems, that you spot those early and then you start to adjust. And I think if we really took more of that attitude as a government and really drove that through the way we look at running projects and programs, we'd have a lot more success in acquisition.
I think I'd like to suggest a different perspective. There's a real need for us to deliver lethality to the warfighter before our near peers or the non-state actors. On the 809 panel, when we were formed, the staffers who wrote the legislation, Ben participated, but he didn't come talk to us. He sent Bill instead. There you go. The real issue was when you look out at the threat environment that we face in the United States, and you look at our capabilities that are currently available to us in our inventory, there's a huge delta. And the problem with that delta is that our potential enemies don't have to go through the process that Ben talked to you about when he was talking about what they go through in the process. In fact, when we went out to interview companies in Silicon Valley, we were there a day after delegations from China had been there offering to buy what they had with a checkbook or a credit card. And the United States government didn't know about those companies, and they had great technology. The challenge that we face is figuring out how to make all this process that's important work for us faster, because we can't afford another Pearl Harbor. We can't, I mean, we can't afford it. When Pearl Harbor happened, we had an industrial capability to respond. It wasn't focused on defense production, but it existed. Don't have that today. So what I think we have to focus on, all of us, is how to get through the process in a way which maintains the capacity we have and the trust people have in the process, but do it in a way that allows us to get stuff faster. It'd be a terrible thing to have stuff in the country that we could save somebody's life, but we couldn't buy it, and our enemies could.
If I could jump on that. So I think what Dave's talking about, you know, you had in the history of the country a government/defense base and then the commercial base, which merged together when it needed to, and then over time it's bifurcated to the point where a large commercial sector, it doesn't see interest or availability or opportunity to even penetrate that, because you need to know all these special rules and you have to know this and that, and it's just too hard, or at least perceived to be. And why not link those two together? And I think that gets back to no matter how many times we organize, you know, change rules, you know, reform is more about the people than it is about issuing the policy memo, writing up, updating the regulation, getting that new statutory provision in there, and then high-fiving and all go home. Whether it's ever implemented or implemented the way it was intended, you know, it becomes a top-down type driven system, and the competencies of our acquisition workforce today are driven top-down. What about a world where we're all on the same planet, we're all in the same sector, where we're training and learning together through a commercially oriented infrastructure, government and industry, private sector, et cetera, and you move around between sectors. You know, a lot of us old-timers were under the old defined benefit plan, the golden handcuffs that kept you in the government until it was time to go. And in the new workforce, they're going to be coming and going. And wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a floor of opportunity and knowledge and experience where you went from the Defense Department to Motorola to Amazon to Washington, D.C., and back again through small business, et cetera, with a floor of knowledge that you're constantly communicating on the same planet. And that's where we're driving towards, with an open, a well-understood system that drives demand, and that starts where we don't major in political science and end up in contracting. And how many people ended up in contracting? Nobody thought they were going to do it in 11th grade. But through college-oriented programs and training from the commercial sector, the demand is driven, and then the U.S. government, Defense Department at the lead, can recruit those people because there's a demand, because they're aware of that career field, and you're getting the top talent. And then there's that knowledge and introspection from both sectors that know that we're here and that we're looking for that experience. Has been demonstrated where we can still match wits with any country in the world, but not the way we're organized and process-driven today.
I might just comment. You know, my background, of course, is all in IT. So, and I don't come from the defense sector per se, although I worked at DHS. And I guess as a CIO, former CIO in government, you know, I'm the first to say we need to move faster, and even more important than that, I think we need to the government view from an IT perspective now should be, where can we ultimately just go and leverage commercial technology right away, right? So I've been a proponent now for years that, and other than in the classified world, we ought to be shedding our IT infrastructure assets as quickly as we can, moving to as-a-service models, both for compute, for networking, as well as even to SaaS-based models for many of our applications where it's possible to do so. It's easy to say this, not an easy transition, but that gives you a lot more agility, right? If you've got that kind of capability to then start to work with organizations like digital services organizations or 18F, for instance, in GSA, to work to then focus your IT efforts on supporting the mission and business of your agency, whatever it may be, rather than worrying about the lower levels of the IT stack where you're worried about the underlying compute or networking capabilities. So I'm all in, and I believe we're starting to really see that sea change. And now with things like FedRAMP and what we've been able to do from a security perspective, I think many of those barriers are starting to really just move away. So that, coupled with agile development and management techniques, I really do feel like we're on a cusp of really, from an IT perspective at least, being able to shift the way in which we do government IT to a much better place.
And that shift, I think, will largely accommodate that reduction in cycle time and process and improve speed. And as Hondo talked about this morning, it's not just speed of our process, of your procurement person. Like Mike said, I'm not sure how many of us in 11th grade would have said, yes, I want to be a procurement bureaucrat right when I grow up. But look around, many of you are, so congratulations. But one thing that he talked about, it's not just that part of the process, it's actually delivering that capability out to the field, out to the person that really needs to put that into motion, whether that's in the DoD world or whether that's providing a service or benefit in the civilian world. And I know, Dave, I would think through all the discussions at 809, speed and users talking about the process, the whole process, all the way from requirements generation, all the way through delivery sustainment. Had to be something that the Section 809 panel looked at, and you mentioned going out and visiting folks in Silicon Valley, and their cycle times, their little cycle is pretty short. Any insights or discussions from the panel that you could share with us?
Well, I think part of our challenge in speed and part of our desire to leverage what's available in the global supply chain is risk. And a risk that we didn't have or didn't recognize 10, 15 years ago. I mean, cybersecurity is huge. It's huge. And the parts that we use in weapon systems or day-to-day management systems in various agencies, they all come basically from the same supply chain. They're all sharing the supply chain, and so how do we structure a strategy that allows us to continue leveraging what's available in the global supply chain and provide for the necessary security we need so that somebody doesn't decide one day, using the president's example, some fat kid sitting on a sofa, that would have been me in high school, using their computer, hacks into your agency and literally shuts it down forever because they're able to do it. Because the parts, the software that we're using came from a supply chain that was somehow infiltrated. At the same time, we recognize we can't afford, and even if we could, there's no guarantee the security would be any better, to create our own domestic sources for all of this stuff. We just don't have right now at least, we don't have the determination or the capability. So that's one aspect of it, and the second thing is we ought to be buying this stuff a different way. That's not, the way we buy IT that's readily available in the marketplace is different than how merchants and sellers do it in the marketplace. And in order for us to increase the speed, provide for the integrity, get value for money, we need to fundamentally change how we buy that stuff. The idea of sending out a solicitation and waiting 30 days for offers and then going through the source selection process we have for those kinds of things doesn't make sense. It reflects a world that existed back when Henry Ford created production lines, but it doesn't reflect how business is done today. And so I think you can expect to see from the panel, although we haven't voted on this yet, we will actually next month, a different way to buy those things that are readily available, or that are readily available and are customized by sellers and as part of their normal sales practices. How much we're able to improve, which accounts for about 80% of the transactions, 20% of the dollars. how much we can improve the things where we're 20% of the transactions, but 80% of the dollars we'll be studying later this summer. Anybody got any ideas? We're really open to them. We got to find a way to make that process faster too, because waiting 25 years for the F-35 is a luxury we won't be able to afford on the next fighter jet.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, Dave, about, not all procurement centers are created equal. You have the 80% and the 20% rule kind of driving at the end. Mike, I know NCMA works a lot in the training and workforce issues, and I would think a lot of contract professionals almost might feel overwhelmed. And Richard talked about we need to be all part of our team, and I think that's great and kind of get that same mission, that same vision and move forward. But it makes a big difference on what kind of team you're on and what the actual acquisition is. And we had several people talk about getting the right tool for the right approach. To some degree, the workforce may be overwhelmed and just see all the options, and some they have and some they don't. How do we think about the workforce as we move forward in this time of what I think will be incredible change for our community?
Well, I think what you can do is you can simplify but not lose what it is you need to know and the competencies you need to have to apply it. So at our association, we've developed a contract management standard, buyer and seller relationships, that are applicable in any sector of the economy, federal, state, local, commercial. And then those are the standards, the basics you need to know, and they're things we would all recognize. And then there's the contract management body of knowledge, a body of knowledge that shows you the competencies that are required to apply that knowledge. The skill sets you need to have. You need to have leadership skills. You need to have negotiation skills. You need to be able to communicate effectively, those sorts of things, how you apply it. And isn't that really, when I look at my career and all of you all, probably the fact that you were able to quote verbatim particular FAR parts or your GSAM or whatever on a different circumstance might have worked 20 years ago or 10 years ago when nobody had Google on the palm of their hand, but now it's more about how you apply it. It's the judgment. Who are the real leaders? And in any organization, it could be the lowest graded or the highest graded. It's that leadership skill. Those are the competencies. So when I get back to, and what would be a uniform standard to measure that? And so we've developed, what we've developed is that type of structure that allows us to perform those assessments on curricula, on coursework, on organizational assessment, and finally individual assessment, that's commonly known as the certifications. And a real certification based on knowledge and experience, not time sitting in classes, and if your pulse is still there on Friday afternoon, you pass the class. Those are certificate programs, and there's plenty of them. And by the way, and maybe it's controversial, but why don't we rely on the commercial marketplace to drive that? That community, that cottage community is out there, and they would rise to that challenge to meet any new skill sets or competencies. And then each employer, whether it's the United States Department of Defense, GSA, or et cetera, will always have to augment that with unique policies, processes, whatever, unique to their individual organizations, whether that's Leidos or Apple.
Well, as you think about that training, Dave talked about, and Rich also talked about changing the way we're buying. Then how do you train in a way that if we're interested in learning how to improve that process cycle, how do we take the training and not just train the government way? How do we understand commercially how the marketplace works to help us better inform and have some data to help us inform perhaps even some broader policy changes?
Let me suggest that we have to change our whole view of the workforce. The day where we have one-size-fits-all capability is gone. It's been gone for a long time. The idea that someone gets certified at level 3 and they can go do construction one day and buy a weapon system the next day and then buy an IT system the third day, and on the fourth day we give them toilet paper to buy, that's gone. And by the way, the system that supports that ought to be gone as well. So I really think fundamentally, while training and education is absolutely important, and NCMA is doing a great job at it, I think we have to rethink how we recruit people, how we train them, how we retain them, and then how we employ them. We don't send engineers in to do birthday parties. They might be very good at it, but they tend not to be. They tend to be focused on something else. Please, engineers, don't hate me for using that example.
So
It's the
Richard
first
and I,
thing
we
that
won't.
yeah, we would know.
take offense.
It's the first thing that came to mind. I want somebody artistic who does birthday parties regularly to do birthday parties. So I really think as we look at the workforce of the future, and as we look at the challenges we face in procurement in the future, that we need to start thinking about specializations. That doesn't mean you get pigeonholed in one place for your entire career, but it's well, it's stupid to think that you have people who are that fungible in today's environment. The nature of how people do business in market segments is different from segment to segment. We don't realize that in the government. We treat it all as gray, and we need to start adding color to that process.
Well, one area that has certainly seen some specialization is IT and IT modernization. I know, Richard, you've addressed that in several of your positions, DHS and IRS. The ACT-IAC Act has passed, and not only did it pass, but now it's also got, I think, $100 million of funding. And I think one of the things agencies are also looking at are what are they going to do with working capital fund? How does that work? I know, Richard, you've got a lot of experience, not just in modernizing big IT systems, but also working capital funds. What do you think agencies and their industry should be looking at as they?
Yeah, no, I'm actually pleased to see the MGT Act pass. I mean, obviously, in our world, for any one agency, $100 million is a lot. But when you think about it across government, it's not going to transform, right, us from an IT perspective. But that being said, the act itself and the fact that there would be more discipline brought, the idea of building these business cases, I think is goodness. I'm a huge fan of both top-down and bottom-up work. So in IT, you still definitely need top-down planning. I mean, if you're in a complex organization, the IRS tax processing, 350 plus major systems that are integrated together, I mean, believe me, you need some really top-down planning if you're going to start changing that system in any significant way. But you also need bottom-up, right? Agile techniques and new things and enabling, if you will, organizations within agencies to be able to go out there and innovate quickly, but do it in the right way. I mean, cybersecurity, Dave mentioned earlier, and that's one of the reasons why MGT Act with FITARA, if it's done right, should work well. Because one of the big problems I had when I was at DHS was this whole rogue IT notion, right? I don't mind the innovation happening out there in the end in the field, but my goodness, you hate to see systems go online. You go, oh, that just popped up. What is that? You go find out there's absolutely no security controls around these systems, right? So too much of that in government, and we've got to be able to rein that in, but rein that in a way that doesn't kill the innovation. That's number one. On MGT Act itself, I was very fortunate. When I was at the IRS and running the modernization program, we had a working capital fund structure. I had 3-year money. It made a huge difference. Why did it make a huge difference? Because in most of my work in government, we've been stuck with that 1-year money. And it's really hard. It's hard enough to run a major program, an IT program, when you have none of those kind of constraints. But when you don't know what your funding is going to be year to year, and you got to spend it in 1 year, that's really difficult, okay? And you end up wasting a lot of money, let's be honest. You end up wasting money doing that. So this idea of working capital fund structures where you can have an agency, whether it's funded through the GSA fund or whether it's going to be your own funds that you can harvest from savings you can garner, and then put it into this kind of working capital fund structure, so you have a much better chance, I think, of managing that modernization effectively for your agency. So it's a great tool, okay? Now it's got to be used right. I know the appropriators don't always like it, so you got to have the right kind of reporting mechanisms in place. But if you can get all that to work, and we did that effectively at the IRS, I think it's a very, very good tool for agencies to leverage.
Yeah, I think agencies will find that's going to be a good tool, but you're right, using it appropriately will be important, because in this town it takes kind of one using it the wrong way, and then the hammer comes down for everybody else.
And let me add that it's a good news story for industry as well. I mean, because the solutions that industry is providing allows them the flexibility to move at the speed of innovation. I mean, you're not building systems over long periods of time. It puts the decision-making in the hands of the people who own the system and have responsibility for it, and it puts local accountability in place, and those are valuable attributes. And then the Congress did another great thing, which is they addressed the budget issue, as you suggested, by creating the workaround to the budget. And we ought to look at that as whether that might make some sense in other contexts as well.
Excellent. President's management agenda came out last week. A lot of interesting tidbits in that. It talks some about the workforce. Emily mentioned that during her chat about one of the things at GSA. It talked about program management. It talked a lot about data. Do you see a time that this is where we can start to really use data to help us make decisions as we go through the process, even looking at data on as we build our requirements, working through the process, and how do you use data moving through when you're really trying to support and create informed decisions? Anybody want to take a whack at that one?
Well, I think one of the big problems we have in the government is we don't want to get rid of old systems. Those old systems weren't designed to collect the data that we need today. I mean, look at FPDS. From a contracting perspective, if you were trying to manage spend, how could you use the data we collect in FPDS to manage your spend? It doesn't tell you what you bought. It tells you that you bought something in a category. No company out there manages their spend that way. But when we created FPDS, nobody wanted to pay, because there wasn't a way to do it across agencies, to provide for more discrete data elements. And that's just one small example of the fact that we have lots of data in paper. None of it, that's unfair. Most of it's not available to us in a digitized format so you can use it in decision making. And in today's environment, how can you make educated decisions whether you're buying an IT system or you're buying the next generation of fighter bombers or you're buying the next generation of medical equipment to provide support on the battlefield? It's nuts. Data is really important. People talk about it. I don't see them committed to actually doing it.
Yeah, how do we shift from kind of swimming in that sea of data to having an environment of information?
We got more data than anybody knows what to do with it. We just can't get to it.
Yeah.
I might throw out an example where I think this whole initiative on TBM for IT cost data, right? I mean, on the face of it, it looks like a good thing. When I was in government, we did some initiatives similar to that, trying to get better insight to cost data, because it is hard. How do you make good decisions when you don't even know what you're really spending, right, at enough detail to help you? My only concern about it is good initiative is we got to be practical about these things too. And I always say, let's get to the 80% solution, because getting to the 95 or 99% solution is incredibly difficult to get to, and I'm not sure the extra value there is worth it. But the other thing about something like that initiative, which is really to get that cost data for IT, is you better use it then, right? And so benchmarking, I think this is a great area where you can do benchmarking, right? And not just benchmarking against yourself, but benchmarking against, hey, what's industry doing out there, right? I mean, simple example, when I was at the IRS, we were able to get some good data, or at least some relatively good data about some systems. And it's like, take something like email. Now this goes back 10 years. But you know, we were finding we're spending 10 times what it cost for you to get email on a commercial, a large commercial company the same size as the IRS. Well, okay, there's an area of focus. So we went to work on replacing that email system and moving to something that was industry standard, right? So that we could drive that cost down. It's just one small example. But the data for the data, I think sometimes we get caught up too much in government about trying to get that data right. But think about how you're going to use that data to improve your decision making. That's the real key.
Yeah.
And the component, the corollary to that is what I started with earlier, which is the element of risk. because we all make decisions, and we're all willing to have some element of risk in that decision. So how much data do you need in order to make an intelligent decision, and how much risk, or what's the risk tolerance of the organization? Because if there is no risk tolerance, one of the barriers I see that Congress and some of in the executive branch are trying to address today, there's no risk tolerance, then no amount of data will get you over the perfection.
Right.
And so it's, what information do you need? How, can you get it in a timely manner? And what's the risk tolerance to that decision making?
Well, Alan's done a great job bringing us kind of full circle. Any questions from you all?
While you're doing that, Greg, I would add too, with regards to data, is, as we've seen our profession evolve over the years from less time spent creating that data, analyzing that, and using tools that are available. You've got vendors here, with tables that are selling those kinds of tools. That's probably the biggest source of change we see at our conferences, is more companies offering these kinds of tools to analyze and rack and stack data, allowing the professional to change and evolve into knowing what to do with it and how to make those judgment decisions. That's where the rising tide lifts all boats.
Questions? All right.
Tiffany's got one.
Did you guys pay her at lunch to ask her?
No, you didn't. You didn't.
We should have. Yeah.
You're good.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. So we spent much of the morning, right, talking about the strategic work that government is doing, how we need to develop our workforce, how we need to improve acquisition, reform, et cetera, et cetera. It feels like, at least, I don't know, probably the last 7 to 10 years, we get about 6 months from a contracting perspective, about 6 months out of the year to focus on really how to drive strategic change, and then the back half of those 6 months having a nervous breakdown because we have to get procurements out the door before the money expires.
Yes.
And this year in particular is going to be very, very challenging for us as a community, and even for industry to be able to respond to the amount of procurements that we've got to get done before September 30th. So with that said, any thoughts in terms of how to influence the behavior in terms of how the Hill is budgeting? For us, any insights in terms of how that may improve? I know we've got a number of industry associations in the 809 panel. Hi, David. Up there in terms of any advice you're providing to the Hill on how they need to change that behavior so we can be better buyers.
Yeah. Al Berman is leading our Team 7 on the 809 panel, which is looking at budgeting and the fiscal laws that result from that. And in that process, we're already working on, but have not yet settled on, several recommendations to Congress that would give us greater flexibility in those years when Congress doesn't get us a budget on time, recognizing that,
That's every year.
well, at least for the last several decades. But that shouldn't be a reflection on the performance of my boss, the Congress that chartered us in the first place.
No, not at all.
Right. But yeah, so we are definitely looking at some suggestions that might, for example, allow us to carry over funds, O&M money, for a certain period of time when Congress doesn't appropriate it on time. And we're looking at issues in terms of what to do with expiring funds and whether those can be extended even further in terms of making a recommendation. But we haven't settled on any yet, and we're still interested in anybody's suggestions about how we might fix it. Practically speaking, no one's going to make Congress deliver a budget on time. The last time they faced this conundrum was when they moved the fiscal year from July 1st to October 1st, thinking that that would give them the time to get the budget out on time.
Now we need to move it to March.
So let me suggest a couple of things. The MGT Act is a good example of where Congress recognized that the budgeting process was out of sync with the evolution of technology, and so by creating the revolving fund, a big help. And you know better, others, about the GSA capabilities and some of those funding. In this year's Appropriations Act, we were a strong proponent, we at Professional Service Council, a strong proponent of giving the agencies flexibility beyond the end of the federal fiscal year to spend the money. Now, only the Department of Defense got a little bit, and they got it only for those accounts that are called operations and maintenance. They're fast-spend accounts that the money has to be spent at the end of the calendar year. There's also, in our view, a good opportunity to move away from spending based on the calendar to spending based on milestones. And as you move to more programmatic or portfolios, I think there are other techniques. And there seems to be a willingness, again, on the part of Congress, to move away from what I talked about earlier, which was a focus on inputs. That's what appropriations is, to a focus on speed to outcomes. And I think there is a growing willingness, the Appropriations Committee being dragged along, but we see lots of examples throughout the laws of the agency programs that are giving some of that flexibility. There is hope yet. One of the side elements in the February budget agreement was a requirement to create a joint committee to relook at that budgeting process. They're supposed to come up with a set of recommendations at the end of the year. Everybody knows that the budgeting process from the Congress needs some help.
We might have time. One quick question. Anybody?
You don't need a mic, Ian.
I'm interested in a question about industry. How prepared is industry to actually accept and support and thereby also take advantage of all of the innovations that we're talking about now? For example, you see in the OTA space, industry freaking out and calling it a sneaky, nefarious way of handing deals to single providers. You see problems people are having with the newly provided online portal proposal, right? You see industry talking about, wait, what is the big need for all of these innovation scouting organizations like DIUX, et cetera, because we in industry, in the defense industry and everywhere else, have been just as innovative, if not more so, than anybody else. If we are to continue in this process, government does need to organize itself and engage in innovation, in acquisition, I would argue, with a little bit more consolidation and coordination. However, it's going to be significantly more difficult if industry tries to block those things as being nefarious or as being sole sourcing or as being a variety of other things. So from that perspective, I would ask, what's industry ready to do?
Well, let me challenge the premise a little bit, because I think a lot of the techniques we're seeing today actually came from industry. And so it is not that there's a reluctance to embrace some of these reforms. In fact, we've been a proponent of them for decades. Greater reliance on the private sector, reduce some of the arbitrary compliance and focus on procedural perfection. And so if you look at some of the techniques that have been employed in the commercial marketplace, many of those are now finding their way into government. It's not, so I think your premise is, I don't agree with the premise. Now, are there procurements where there is a tension between incumbents or those who are traditional versus non-traditional? Absolutely. Those are marketplace issues. I don't think they are cross-industry-wide. The reality is that we need to change. We no longer support an acquisition system that takes 300 days to make simple purchases or that relies on only a handful of companies. If you look at the National Defense Strategy, it talks about creating a national innovation base. It's not a defense industrial, it's a national innovation base. We talk about a national business interest base, which is comprised of far more companies than are just doing business with the federal marketplace today. So I think what I see is many of those reform initiatives coming out of industry, and industry well prepared to compete for them as long as there's a level playing field and open competition for that.
And we've spoken on the panel to literally hundreds of companies, large and small, non-traditional companies and traditional companies. And I think it's fair to say that they all presented their desire to work with the department to do things better, to reduce that speed, et cetera. The concerns that they raised, I think, were fair. If we're going to change the process, it ought not to discriminate between one company and the next, except on their ability to perform and their value they offer. But there ought not to be, for example, a process discrimination. I think that's a valid issue. On the issue of OTAs, the reason people are using OTAs is because they're trying to get around the FAR. That's the only reason they're using them today. It's not what OTAs were originally designed for in the Space Act, which was to promote innovation by sharing IP and equipment and other things in order to promote the development of that innovation. They weren't a contract with dollars, just not a FAR contract. So on the OTAs, I think industry's raised a good point. I don't think the government, and for sure I don't think the department is served by the expansive use of OTAs. What we need to do is fix the system so every company can play and they know what the rules of the game are when they come to the table. By the way, the government ought to know its own rules and how to use them.
All right, I think we've drawn to an end. Please join me in thanking the panel.